On January 23, 2025, U.S. Representatives John Moolenaar Republican Michigan and Tom Suozzi Democrat New York jointly introduced the Restoring Trade Fairness Act, marking a significant bipartisan legislative effort aimed at revoking China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status. This initiative follows an executive order by President Trump which tasked the Secretary of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative with evaluating legislative proposals regarding trade relations with the People's Republic of China (PRC). Background and context. China was granted PNTR status in 2000, a decision that was part of its accession to the World Trade Organization (WTO). The hope was that this move would lead to economic liberalization and fair trading practices in China. However, over the past 2 decades, the U.S. has faced notable challenges, including a decline in manufacturing jobs, widespread job losses, and significant intellectual property theft attributed to the Chinese Communist Party's CCP. Critics argue that PNTR status has allowed the CCP to exploit U.S. markets without adhering to fair competition norms. Key provisions of the bill. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act includes several critical provisions aimed at restructuring U.S. China trade relations. 1. Revoke PNTR for China. The bill seeks to eliminate the need for annual congressional votes to renew PNTR status, effectively ending the preferential trade treatment China has enjoyed. 2. New tariff structure. It proposes a new tariff regime, imposing a minimum 35% tariff on non-strategic goods and a minimum 100% tariff on strategic goods over a phased period of 5 years. 3. Support for U.S. industries. Revenue generated from these tariffs would be used to support American farmers and manufacturers who could be impacted by retaliatory measures from China, and to fund military necessities aimed at countering CCP aggression in the Pacific. Legislative support and bipartisan consensus. The introduction of this legislation has garnered support from both sides of the aisle. Senators Tom Cotton, Republican Arkansas, and Jim Banks, RAN, introduced companion legislation in the Senate. Moolenaar and Suozzi emphasized that the bill is crucial for safeguarding U.S. national security, enhancing supply chain resilience, and revitalizing American manufacturing jobs. This bipartisan consensus reflects a growing recognition of the need to reassess trade relations with China, influenced by the perception that the CCP's trade practices have harmed American workers and national interests. Economic impact and rationale. Data from the U.S. International Trade Commission (ITC) indicates that previous tariffs imposed under Section 301 have not significantly contributed to inflation, contrary to some predictions. Instead, these tariffs have led to a diversification of supply chains away from China, reducing dependency on Chinese imports in critical sectors such as electronics and automotive parts. For example, a 1% increase in tariffs has correlated with a 2% reduction in imports from China, showcasing the effectiveness of tariffs in altering trade dynamics. Common themes across sources. Analysis from various sources underscores a growing bipartisan consensus on the necessity of reassessing U.S.-China trade relations. The legislation is framed as a necessary step toward restoring fairness in international trade and protecting American economic interests. The narrative consistently highlights the adverse effects of China's trade practices on U.S. manufacturing and job markets. Divergence in perspectives. Despite the common agreement on the need for reform, there are divergent views regarding the specifics of the economic sectors affected, potential retaliation from China, and the strategic importance of certain goods outlined in the bill. Some sources emphasize the broader implications for U.S. foreign policy and national security. Conclusion. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a pivotal moment in U.S. trade policy, reflecting a concerted effort to recalibrate the economic relationship with China. This legislative initiative aims to address long-standing grievances surrounding unfair trade practices while bolstering the U.S. manufacturing sector and safeguarding national security interests. As congressional discussions progress, the implications of this act could reshape the future of U.S.-China economic relations significantly. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act by U.S. Representatives John Moolenaar and Tom Suozzi on January 23, 2025 aims to revoke China's permanent normal trade relations PNTR status, marking a significant bipartisan shift in U.S. trade policy. This legislative move raises several counterintuitive points that merit discussion. 1. Bipartisanship in trade policy. At first glance, one might assume that trade policy is typically a divisive issue along partisan lines in the U.S. However, the introduction of this bill demonstrates a rare instance of bipartisan unity around the need to reassess U.S. China trade relations. Representatives from both sides of the aisle recognize the perceived threats posed by China's economic practices and the implications for national security, suggesting that concerns about economic competition and security can transcend party politics. This unified front challenges the common narrative that partisanship is the primary driver of legislative initiatives. 2. Effectiveness of tariffs. The bill proposes the implementation of new tariffs, including a minimum 35% tariff on non-strategic goods and a minimum 100% tariff on strategic goods. Traditionally, tariffs are viewed as detrimental to consumer prices and economic growth. However, the proponents of this bill argue that previous tariffs under Section 301 did not significantly contribute to inflation and instead fostered a diversification of supply chains away from China. This counterintuitive perspective challenges the conventional wisdom that tariffs are always harmful, suggesting instead that they can be utilized as effective tools for reshaping trade dynamics without necessarily causing adverse economic effects in the domestic market. 3. Job creation versus job loss. One might expect that revoking PNTR status and implementing tariffs would lead to significant job losses, particularly in industries reliant on Chinese imports. However, the narrative from the bill's supporters emphasizes that these measures are aimed at revitalizing American manufacturing jobs that have been lost due to unfair competition from China. The argument is that the long-term benefits of strengthening domestic industries and reducing reliance on foreign imports will outweigh any short-term disruptions. This perspective is counterintuitive because it suggests that taking a more protectionist stance could ultimately lead to job creation rather than job loss, which contradicts the typical economic discourse surrounding free trade. 4. National security versus economic engagement. The bill frames the revocation of PNTR as a vital step for enhancing national security, asserting that the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) has exploited trade relations to undermine American economic strength. This position presents a counterintuitive view that prioritizing economic disengagement can serve as a strategy for protecting national interests. Traditionally, economic engagement has been viewed as a means to foster cooperation and peace. The shift towards a more adversarial economic stance against China suggests a recalibration of how economic relations are perceived in the context of national security. 5. Perception of globalization. The narrative surrounding globalization has often centered on its benefits, such as increased trade, economic growth, and consumer choice. However, the introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act signals a growing recognition of the downsides of globalization, particularly when it comes to reliance on authoritarian regimes. The bill's proponents argue that the globalization of the past 2 decades has led to significant vulnerabilities in the U.S. economy, primarily due to China's rise as a global economic power. This shift represents a counterintuitive realization that the interconnectedness of global trade can also pose risks, prompting a reevaluation of how trade relationships are structured. 6. Impact on consumer prices. Typically, tariffs and trade restrictions are associated with higher consumer prices due to decreased competition and increased costs of imported goods. However, the bill's supporters cite data indicating that previous tariffs have not led to significant inflationary pressures. Instead, they argue that the tariffs have encouraged businesses to seek alternative suppliers, thereby enhancing supply chain resilience. This counterintuitive claim challenges the conventional belief that tariffs are inherently inflationary, suggesting that they can be managed in a way that mitigates adverse effects on consumers. In conclusion, the Restoring Trade Fairness Act encapsulates several counterintuitive themes within the broader discourse on U.S. China trade relations. By highlighting bipartisan support, the potential effectiveness of tariffs, and the complex interplay between national security and economic engagement, the bill challenges prevailing assumptions about trade policy and its implications for the American economy. This legislative effort reflects a significant turning point in how the U.S. perceives its economic relationship with China, emphasizing the need for a re-evaluation of trade strategies in light of evolving global dynamics. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act, introduced by Representatives John Moolenaar and Tom Suozzi, represents a significant legislative effort to revoke China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status. This initiative is noteworthy not only for its bipartisan support but also for its potential implications for U.S.-China relations, economic policy, and national security. Key content overlooked. 1. Bipartisan cooperation. While many reports highlight the bipartisan nature of the bill, the significance of this cooperation in the current political climate often goes unexamined. The fact that both sides of the aisle are united in their stance against China's trade practices indicates a profound shift in American politics regarding foreign economic policy. This unity suggests a consensus that transcends traditional partisan divides, hinting at a re-evaluation of America's global economic strategy amidst growing concerns over national security and economic sovereignty. The implications of this collaboration may set a precedent for future bipartisan efforts on similarly contentious issues. 2. Historical context of PNTR. The background of China being granted PNTR in 2000 as a strategy to promote liberalization is often glossed over. This historical context is crucial as it illustrates the evolution of U.S. trade policy and highlights the significant miscalculations made by policymakers. Understanding this history is key to grasping the magnitude of the current legislative shift and the acknowledgement that previous strategies aimed at integrating China into the global economy have largely failed. This failure not only affects economic relations but also has broader implications for international diplomacy and security dynamics. 3. Economic impact beyond tariffs. The proposed tariff structures, 35% on non-strategic goods and 100% on strategic goods, are central to the bill. Yet the broader economic impact of these tariffs on supply chains and consumer prices is often oversimplified. The bill aims to reduce dependency on Chinese imports, but the potential consequences for U.S. companies that rely on Chinese manufacturing and supply chains may be significant. Understanding the complexities of global supply chains, including the risks of inflation and the possible disruption to industries heavily reliant on Chinese goods, is essential. This nuanced analysis of economic repercussions is vital for stakeholders in various sectors who may be affected by the legislation. 4. Strategic goods classification. The classification of strategic goods as referenced in the bill is a critical yet often overlooked detail. The bill bases its classifications on the Biden administration's Advanced Technology Product List and China's Made in China 2025 plan. This alignment with strategic national interests signals a deliberate shift towards prioritizing certain sectors such as technology and defense in the U.S. economic framework. This focus reflects an understanding that not all trade is equal and that certain sectors are vital for national security and technological leadership. The implications for businesses operating in these sectors could be substantial, influencing investment decisions and international partnerships. 5. Revenue allocation. The bill's provision that tariff revenues will be directed to support U.S. farmers and manufacturers affected by Chinese retaliation is crucial yet understated. This allocation highlights a strategic approach to mitigating the potential backlash from China and emphasizes a commitment to sustaining American industries. The potential for these funds to bolster domestic production and innovation should be a focal point of discussion as it aligns economic interests with national security objectives. This aspect of the legislation underscores the interconnectedness of trade policy and national economic strategy, particularly in the context of global competition. 6. Broader national security implications. The emphasis on national security throughout the bill is significant yet often overshadowed by discussions of trade and tariffs. The narrative that trade relations with China are intertwined with national security concerns is becoming increasingly prominent. The bill presents a clear message that economic policies are not merely about trade but also about safeguarding the U.S. against perceived threats from the Chinese Communist Party. This perspective shifts the discourse from a purely economic analysis to one that incorporates geopolitical strategy, reflecting a growing recognition of the importance of economic resilience in national defense. Conclusion. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act is a critical piece of legislation that signifies a pivotal moment in U.S. China relations and trade policy. By focusing on the overlooked aspects such as bipartisan cooperation, historical context, economic implications, strategic goods classification, revenue allocation, and national security concerns, we gain a deeper understanding of the legislation's significance. This comprehensive perspective is essential for stakeholders across various sectors, as the outcomes of this legislative effort will likely shape the future of American trade and economic policy in a rapidly changing global landscape. The legislative landscape surrounding U.S.-China relations is evolving, and understanding these nuances is crucial in anticipating future developments. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act by U.S. Representatives John Moolenaar and Tom Suozzi marks a significant shift in American trade policy regarding China. Below are 4 key points for in-depth analysis and discussion. 1. Bipartisan consensus and legislative strategy. The bipartisan nature of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a rare alignment between the two major political parties in the U.S. on a critical issue: China's trade practices and their impact on the American economy. This consensus has been building over successive administrations, as both parties have increasingly recognized the failures of the initial approach to China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status granted in 2000. The act transcends party lines, illustrating a unified stance against what many see as unfair economic practices by the Chinese Communist Party's CCP. Discussion points. What factors have led to this bipartisan agreement, and how might it influence future trade policies? How does this act reflect broader sentiments within American society regarding China, and how might it shape public opinion on international trade? In what ways could this legislative strategy serve as a model for addressing other contentious issues in American politics? 2. Economic rationale and potential impact. The bill aims to revoke PNTR status and impose significant tariffs on Chinese goods with the intention of revitalizing American manufacturing and protecting national security. Previous tariffs, particularly those enacted under Section 301, have reportedly not contributed to inflation, but rather prompted the diversification of supply chains away from China. This shift illustrates a strategic recalibration of U.S. economic dependencies. Discussion points. What are the potential short-term and long-term economic impacts of the proposed tariffs on both U.S. consumers and industries? How might the new tariff structure affect American businesses that rely on Chinese imports? What evidence supports the assertion that tariffs can effectively reshape trade dynamics? And what are the counterarguments? 3. National security considerations. The proposed legislation emphasizes national security by framing the revocation of PNTR as a means to protect U.S. economic interests against perceived threats from the CCP. The bill's provisions to use tariff revenues to support military needs and bolster supply chain resilience reflect a growing recognition that economic and national security are intertwined. Discussion points. How does the intersection of trade policy and national security manifest in the Restoring Trade Fairness Act? In what ways could this act contribute to a broader strategy for U.S. foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region? What implications could this legislation have for U.S.-China relations? And how might it influence other countries' trade policies with China? 4. Implications for global trade and supply chains. The revocation of PNTR status and the introduction of new tariffs could serve as a precedent for other nations grappling with similar trade issues. As the U.S. seeks to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing, it may encourage allied countries to reconsider their economic relationships with China. Discussion points. How might this legislative move influence global trade patterns and the behavior of multinational corporations? What role do alliances play in shaping a collective response to China's economic practices, and how could this affect global supply chains? In light of this legislation, how should businesses prepare for changes in the regulatory and trade landscape? Conclusion. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act represents a crucial juncture in U.S. trade policy aiming to recalibrate the economic relationship with China. By analyzing the bipartisan support, economic implications, national security considerations, and global trade impacts, stakeholders can better understand the potential ramifications of this significant legislative initiative. Each point raises important questions that could shape discussions around U.S. trade strategy and its broader implications for global economics and geopolitics. 1. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. This was a significant piece of legislation in the United States that raised tariffs on hundreds of imports. The goal was to protect American industries during the Great Depression, but it led to retaliatory tariffs from other countries, exacerbating the global economic downturn. The act is often cited as a cautionary example of the negative impact of protectionist trade policies. 2. The Trade Act of 1974. This act marked a significant shift in U.S. trade policy by allowing for the imposition of trade sanctions against countries that engaged in unfair trade practices. It provided the President with the authority to negotiate trade agreements and implement tariffs in response to foreign trade barriers. The act was a response to rising concerns about trade deficits and the competitiveness of U.S. industries, particularly in manufacturing. 3. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment 1974. This U.S. legislation targeted the Soviet Union's immigration policies by linking trade benefits to the country's human rights record. It denied most favored nation MFN status to countries that restricted immigration rights. The amendment significantly impacted U.S.-Soviet trade relations and was a key part of the broader strategy of leveraging trade to influence foreign policy and human rights practices. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act on January 23, 2025 marks a significant turning point in U.S.-China trade relations. This bipartisan initiative, led by Representatives John Moolenaar and Tom Suozzi, seeks to revoke China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status, reflecting a growing consensus in Washington regarding the need to reassess trade policies in light of perceived unfair practices by the Chinese Communist Party's CCP. As we project into the future, several key trends and implications arise from this legislative effort. Economic and trade dynamics. 1. Increased tariffs and economic impact. The bill proposes establishing a new tariff structure including a minimum 35% tariff on non-strategic goods and a minimum 100% tariff on strategic goods over a 5-year phase-in period. This is likely to lead to a significant increase in the cost of Chinese imports, which could raise consumer prices in the short term. However, it may also encourage domestic manufacturing and reduce reliance on Chinese goods, potentially revitalizing sectors of the American economy. 2. Supply chain realignment. The anticipated tariffs are expected to accelerate the ongoing trend of supply chain diversification away from China. U.S. companies may seek alternative manufacturing locations in countries with more favorable trade conditions such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico. This shift could lead to a more resilient and diversified supply chain, although it may take time for companies to fully adapt to these changes. 3. Retaliation from China. One potential outcome of revoking PNTR is retaliation from China, which could impose its own tariffs or restrictions on U.S. goods. This could lead to a tit-for-tat escalation in trade tensions impacting various sectors including agriculture, technology, and manufacturing. The U.S. government will need to prepare for and mitigate these retaliatory measures potentially through international coalitions or trade agreements with other countries. Geopolitical implications. For strengthened alliances, as the U.S. takes a firmer stance against China, it may seek to strengthen alliances with other nations that share similar concerns about Chinese economic practices. This could lead to closer economic and military partnerships with countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Enhancing collective security and countering CCP influence. 5. National security considerations. The focus on revoking PNTR and implementing tariffs reflects broader national security concerns regarding China's rise as a global power. By addressing issues related to intellectual property theft, forced labor, and military aggression, the U.S. aims to protect its strategic interests and those of its allies. This approach may lead to increased military spending and investment in technologies that can counteract potential threats from China. Domestic political landscape. 6. Bipartisan consensus. The bipartisan support for the Restoring Trade Fairness Act indicates a broader shift in U.S. politics regarding China. Both parties appear to agree on the need for a tougher stance, which could lead to a more unified approach to foreign policy and trade legislation in the coming years. However, this consensus may also face challenges as different factions within each party advocate for varying approaches to trade and foreign relations. 7. Impact on American workers. The proposed legislation emphasizes protecting American jobs and revitalizing the manufacturing sector. While the long-term goal may be to create more domestic jobs, the immediate impact of increased tariffs could lead to job losses in sectors reliant on Chinese imports. The U.S. government will need to implement supportive measures such as retraining programs and financial assistance to help workers transition in response to these changes. Future trade policy evolution. 8. Long-term trade strategy. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act is likely to be part of a broader long-term strategy to reconfigure U.S. trade relationships not only with China but also with other nations. This could involve renegotiating trade agreements, enhancing trade partnerships with allies, and promoting fair trade practices globally. 9. Focus on technological competitiveness. In response to concerns about China's technological advancements, the U.S. may increase investments in research and development to maintain its competitive edge in critical sectors such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. This focus on innovation could lead to new job creation and economic growth, albeit with an emphasis on protecting sensitive technologies from foreign adversaries. Conclusion. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a pivotal shift in U.S. trade policy towards China, emphasizing national security and economic fairness. As the U.S. navigates this evolving landscape, the implications will be felt across economic, geopolitical, and domestic domains. While the future may hold challenges including potential retaliatory actions from China and transitional hardships for American workers, the overarching goal remains to establish a more competitive and secure economic environment for the United States and its allies. The outcomes of this legislative effort will have lasting effects on U.S.-China relations, shaping the global trade landscape for years to come.